Welcome to Locality's Making Bank podcast, where we continue our exploration of South Florida's entrepreneurial landscape with host Keith Costello, co-founder and CEO of Locality Bank. Sit back, relax, and let South Florida visionaries guide you on an entrepreneurial journey from tribulation to triumph, sharing the very stories that have shaped them.
Alan Levan, welcome to Locality Bank's Making Bank podcast.
Happy to be here.
This is really an exciting moment for us because you're the first banker that we've had on. And that's important for us because you're really a legend in the banking industry. And as a banker who's been here in South Florida for a long time and worked for your friend Leonard Abbas at City National for a long time, and that's actually where I first got to know you. I've followed your career, and you're really just a legend here in South Florida. We're so excited about having you join us and tell your story today.
Well, thank you, Keith. I'm happy to be here, and I'm actually not a banker any longer. I'm a former banker.
Okay, so once a banker, always a banker.
Okay,
right? As long as you're not in handcuffs, then it's okay because there's a few.
My hands are good.
But Alan's written a book, and it's an incredible book. And he was nice enough to send it to me, and it's a big book. I mean, this is not easy, reading. But I read it, and it was a phenomenal story. And after I read it, I happened to be on the NSU board, which Alan chairs, and I went up to him. I said, "Will you be on the podcast? You've got such an incredible story." So I feel more well prepared than I have been for any other guest today. So,
oh, how nice! Yeah.
So we'll start in, your early days. You grew up in New York. You have a very interesting family story. Why don't you just share, your early days?
So I was born in Brooklyn. Once from Brooklyn, always from Brooklyn. We moved out to the island and moved to Florida when I was 15. And actually, that was an incredible turning point in my life because in New York, I was going to a junior-senior high school, which meant you never got to the top until you got to be a senior.
Okay.
And I was going into ninth grade. So I had a long time before I could be top of the hill.
Yeah.
And we moved to Florida, they had junior high schools, or now called middle schools.
Right.
And so immediately when I moved to Florida, I was in ninth grade, which meant I was the senior.
Okay.
I was in the senior class of the middle school, and the exhilaration of, now being, on top really changed my personality a lot.
Well, that's great. And I hope, and coming to Florida too, probably, right? Getting out of Brooklyn, out of the city, getting down here in the sunshine. And so your family was pretty entrepreneurial. Like your dad started, which I don't think a lot of people know, a pest control business, right?
Yes.
And you were involved in that and then morphed into a travel business and just really entrepreneurial beginnings for the family.
My dad was a great salesman. He was an entrepreneur. And there's a funny story about my pest control. After school, I interned at JP Morgan. And while I was there, I had an interest in going into the real estate business. And I was going to come back to Florida. And so after spending 2 years on Wall Street, I decided to come back, but I needed to earn a living. And so I was going to make a stop at my dad's exterminating company and work there until I could figure out how to get into the real estate ownership or development business. And so I gave my notice to JP Morgan, and my supervisor said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going back to Florida to go in the exterminating business." And he looked at me and he said, "Boy, did I make a mistake with you."
That's hysterical. But you did come back and you started working there, but then it wasn't long until you got into the real estate business.
I did. My dad introduced me to a fellow Dolphin fan who was in his section that he had become friends with. And he said, why don't you go see this fella and tell him you're interested in getting in the real estate business, see if he can give you some hints. And I went to see him, and he said, "Well, why don't we be partners?"
This is David Harris.
David Harris.
Yeah.
I want you to be partners. And I said, well, that'd be great, but I don't have any money. He says, don't worry about it. And, and he gave me the opportunity to go out and find some land. And then he said, find an architect. And then he said, build it. And I built a 42-unit building, apartment building. And then we couldn't get permanent financing. So I converted it to a condominium and sold them as condo units. And so in the early 70s, I had now gotten all this experience of finding land, building a building, converting it to a condo, selling condos, within another year, I had acquired for the partnership, 1,000 apartment units in Miami-Dade, including a 447 unit on the Doral Country Club.
Wow. And this is when you're how old?
I was in my mid-20s.
Wow. Yeah, that's it. It's so interesting. And you also had a chapter in the book about how you went to see Leonard Abbott Sr. to get that loan.
Yeah. So I had seen a presentation of a real estate concept of raising money to buy real estate with limited partnerships, and I went to my partner's father, and I needed seed capital to just provide a net worth to the general partner for tax purposes. Mm-hmm. And so we asked him if he could give us $1 million. And of course, I still didn't have any money. And his father stood up behind his desk, and he said, $1 million? I'm not going to give you $1 million. Go see my friend Leonard Abbott Sr. at City National Bank. And so my partner and I went to see him, and they talked about social stuff. They knew each other, and of course, this was all new territory for me. And my partner said, "Well, Mr. Abbott, we'd like to borrow $1 million." And he said, "Okay, you boys are going to guarantee it, right?" And I kind of swallowed hard. And my partner said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, yes, sir. We'll do it." And so he said, "Okay, go downstairs and work it out with the president of the bank." And I said, "Mr. Harris, would you like to know what my idea is that we need $1 million for?" And he said, because in those days, it was all character lending. Yeah. Not so much today. Right. But in those days, the banks relied less on hard collateral and more on people.
Right.
And I got an opportunity to tell him what I was thinking about, and I felt good about it. But he'd already said yes.
Yeah, it's not the way it works today.
No,
think, right?
Definitely not.
But I do think it's important that you mention that, though, because I think if a good banker always starts with character, right, and then okay, let's see your deal, right?
Yes,
and because that's critical.
And we learned that particularly during the recession in 07, 08, 09, that the good guys stayed clean. We worked with them. They did what they could to keep the loans current. And when they got to the end of the recession, everything was fine. The bad guys saw it as an opportunity to default, figured, well, our bank would probably go broke, and they'd be able to discount it from the FDIC.
Right.
And so, separated the group pretty quickly at that time.
I mean, and that's a great point, because I mean, we say that to people all the time. In business, there are always, and no one's seen more ups and downs, I think, than you. If I'm reading this book, I mean, it's incredible the ups and downs you've had, but that's business, right? And everybody is going to encounter tough times. And when you make a loan to somebody, you have to have them understand you're their partner, right? That if they have a problem, come to us and talk about it. We'll get through it together. But if you disappear or don't answer the phone or move to, God knows where.
We worked with hundreds of borrowers who came in. They were serious in intent. They wanted to do the right thing. they were caught in a recession.
Yeah.
And we worked with them. The regulators sometimes weren't real happy about that.
Right.
But we worked every borrower that needed help, that was serious with integrity, we worked with.
Yeah.
It was the guys that just said, this is a great opportunity for us. We're going to be able to discount this loan.
Yeah.
Those are the guys that 10 years later we were getting judgments against.
Right.
And putting them in bankruptcy or whatever the remedy was.
Yeah. So you start IRE, raise $100 million back in 1972.
1972.
That's a lot of money today, but in
Yes.
1972, that's an unbelievable amount of money to raise.
It's amazing what you could do when you're in your 20s and you think you're a genius and you don't realize how much you don't know. But you make up for it with high energy.
Yeah, there's a great lesson right there for. So when you think about that, you were in your 20s and going out there raising $100 million, which is probably $1 billion today. I mean, really, realistically,
it was a lot of money then.
Yeah,
it was a lot of money then.
But the equivalent today would be, astronomical. So IRE became a big success for you, and then along comes. Recession, right? So this is before maybe some of the people listening remember I was in high school and when 74, 75 came around. And that was a bit of a downturn and you had to get through that.
There's actually an interesting lesson there. The way we raised that $100 million is we couldn't get a Merrill Lynch to fund us. There were no major sources of money that would fund us, but we filed an SEC registration and we worked with financial planners and we raised it in $5,000 increments.
Wow.
All around the country. I hired 3-4 of my college buddies and they came down and, for a year we were on the road doing dog and pony shows. And that was in 1972, not 73. The money was coming in so strong, things were great, that in late 73, I started to get nervous. Not that I could predict what was going to happen with the economy or a recession coming. One, I wasn't smart enough. But the money was coming in too easily. And sometimes when things are too good, you just have to step back and try to figure out why that is. And so in 1973, we were raising $10 million a month. And I just cold turkey said, you know what? We can't put this money out properly. We're going to stop raising money. And there were a lot of people that were angry at me. The salespeople we had internally, the brokers that were selling it and making commissions, and the customers that we had sold to who were enjoying high value increases in the real estate we bought and the yields that we were giving.
Sure.
They thought they had been, they finally found somebody they were comfortable with. And we said, we're not raising any more money. And sure enough, a year later, the market just collapsed, just totally collapsed. And the condo market, I think at the time, there were like 30,000 unsold condos. They predicted a 15-year sellout to get rid of all that absorption.
Yeah.
But sometimes, you just, it's the title of my book is Seeing Around Corners. And it's not being clairvoyant. It's just really figuring out why you're doing well and what's going on around you and being aware of that and taking some action. And in our case, it was at the height of our business, raising $10 million a month. Like it's not sustainable.
Right.
And we had competitors that were doing just as well, if not better than us. And so when the recession hit a year later, we had spent that year really focusing on property management and our business operationally. And so when the recession hit, we were ready. All of our competitors went broke. Every single one who was doing what we were doing went broke. We were injured, but we didn't go broke. And we managed to get through that horrible recession.
Oh.
And
that's another great lesson, really being able to just be aware of what's going on and take necessary actions. Otherwise, you end up one of the ones that don't make it if you're not. If you're not
when you get
that.
into a recession, and we know this, Keith, we know this from the banking business, is you have to be able to get to the other side.
Yeah.
The borrowers, the depositors, I mean, just the bank, you have to have enough reserves, liquidity, something you can call upon. It's recessions for a lot of people are great opportunities, great buying opportunities.
Yeah.
But only if you have liquidity.
Only if you're ready.
If you don't have any liquidity, you're having trouble making mortgage payments and you're bouncing around just trying to survive.
You've got a lot of little quotes in here and I remember one of them was always know your downside is one of the things that you
always got to watch downside.
Yeah.
That to me is in everything I do, I evaluate downside. I figure if you're doing something that's high integrity, that's worth doing, and you work hard at it, the upside is unlimited. So you really only have to worry about the downside. What would prevent you from getting to that higher ceiling? And if you work hard at it and you got a good idea, you'll get to that higher ceiling as long as you don't get taken out because you have no control over the markets.
Yeah, that's right. So let's talk about Atlantic Federal Savings and Loan. And you enter the board there and eventually end up, that becomes BankAtlantic. You and Jack Abdo kind of team up and tell that story.
Yeah, so it's a much longer story, which I won't do today, of how we got into Atlantic Federal. But I ended up with a board seat at Atlantic Federal, and at the time was a $2 billion bank. And I had no banking experience other than 2 years at JP Morgan as a trainee.
Right.
Certainly not being trained to do what I ultimately did. And I was at the bank for like 3-4 months. And they asked me if I could take over the bank. And it took 4 or 5 years to do that. But ultimately, we managed to secure control of the bank. And the S&Ls existed for really making home loans and high rate deposits. And I couldn't understand that model. The commercial banking business was a much higher quality business where they made a living on service and attracting deposits that you didn't have to reach for. Mm-hmm. And so we took all the interest rate boards out of the lobbies so people didn't know what we paid for interest. We improved our service dramatically. When I went in there, it was $2 billion of high rate deposits. We stopped paying high rates. We went down to commercial banking rates, which were 0.5% as opposed to 6 or 7 or 8%.
Right.
And we made up for it with service, which is what the commercial banks did and have always done. And so our deposits dropped. Those people that were just flight money, we went from $2 billion to $1.2 billion. We closed 30 out of 50 branches, and we're making more money because our margin jumped.
Yeah.
And then we ultimately grew it to $6 billion. And at the time we sold, we had the highest banking margin of any bank in the state.
Wow.
And that included the behemoths that we know of today that we were competing with, the Barnetts, the Bank of Americas, the Wachovias. We had the highest margin.
And you built an incredible branch network.
Oh, and we ultimately went from 20 branches to 100 branches.
Wow.
All around the state.
Yeah.
It was, we had a great time.
And I think anybody who has been in South Florida for any period of time knows BankAtlantic. I mean, you really were everywhere here in the market, and just did a great job, and an amazing story.
Yeah, and one of the things that helped us grow it was, number one, culture. You know, our position was our associates should enjoy working. And so we created a very fun environment. But the other concept that we had was 7-day banking. And we were open 7 days a week.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And the other bankers would laugh at us and say, 7 days a week, why would you do that? And we were labeled as Florida. We tagged it as Florida's most convenient bank. And so I equated 7-day banking to a gym in an apartment building. And that is, when somebody says, well, where do you live? And you say, well, I live over there. And well, what do you like about that building? Well, it's got this great gym. It's got all the most modern equipment. It's got mirrors on the walls. It's got the track. It's got everything. And then they ask the operative question, and that is, well, do you use it? And the answer is, well, not yet, but it's there when I'm ready. Mm-hmm. It's ready when I'm there to start using the gym.
It's a great story.
7-day banking is exactly the same thing. Nobody banks on Saturday and Sunday, but it's available if they need it. And as a result, our bank became known for service and convenience, and became known as the 7-day bank.
Yeah.
And so that's what built our business, along with a whole bunch of other stuff. But nobody banked on Saturday or Sunday.
And how many employees did you grow to over that period of time, approximately?
Oh, I've forgotten that. It was over 2,000.
Wow. Yeah.
In all of our branches and corporate. It was we had a great time in the banking business.
So let's talk about one of your very difficult moments, and when your wife was kidnapped, which you address in the book. I mean, that must have just been an unbelievable experience to go through.
It was. I was living in South Dade, and the bank headquarters were in Fort Lauderdale. So in those days, I would come home very late, and on this particular date, my wife was with me. She had been in the bank all day. She was a corporate executive of our holding company, and she was helping me at the bank as well. She would attend our executive management meetings, and we came home. There were people that had already occupied our house with our 7-year-old daughter and our housekeeper, and they, we were both held at gunpoint all night, and the good news is, if there was any good news, is they told us quickly that their intent was to rob the bank the next day. So at least we knew they weren't going to kill us right then.
Right.
My wife got into the bed with our 7-year-old daughter, who was asleep at that point, and I slept. I was on the floor. My wife was up all night, concerned about what was going to happen in the morning. It's just my personality. I knew I was going to be challenged in the morning as to what I was going to do. And so I got on the floor. I went right to sleep.
Okay.
So I slept through the night until they kicked me in the morning and woke me up.
Wow.
And my wife and I, that was a part joking, part serious. Like, how could you go to sleep? How could you sleep? I was up all night. But I spent the time driving up to the bank, querying one of the kidnappers that was driving, and they took my wife and daughter in another car, put them in the trunk of the car, and drove them somewhere. And so I had to go into the bank and fill a suitcase of money.
Wow.
And I had to determine during that ride from Miami to Fort Lauderdale whether they would tell me where my wife and daughter was. And so I spent the entire 45-minute ride interrogating the driver, who was one of the kidnappers, whether they would call me and when they were going to call me to tell me where my wife was. And they said, we'll call you in 15 minutes after we get the money. And so I said, I'm talking to a criminal.
Right.
Are you a man of honor? Are you gonna honor that 15 minutes? And he said he would. And there was something about him that I believed him. And so I didn't call the police. I gave the money. I stayed in the bank. And he called me exactly 15 minutes later, which meant the car was pretty close.
Right.
So I figured the car was going to be in the Everglades, but it was pretty close to the bank. And so we went over there and got my wife and daughter out of the trunk of the car. The amazing thing is we drove back to the bank. And by the time we got there, and the span of that was maybe 5-6 minutes, the place was overrun by reporters and cameramen in the parking lot. Wow. When I drove in. Before the police.
Really?
Before the police.
Wow.
And apparently, the newspapers at that time, I don't know if they still do, were monitoring police lines.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so they could get there faster.
Wow.
And so there were a whole bunch of reporters standing in front of my car taking pictures, and I opened my window and said, if you guys don't get out of the way, I'm going to run you over. And I started moving the car. And we got out of that parking lot, went over to the beach, checked into a motel to get some air conditioning, and then told the police where we were, and they came in and interrogated us there. It was pretty horrifying.
Incredible story. And of course, your wife, Susie, just passed away. And the two of you here in South Florida just accomplished so many great things. And I know, offer our sympathy on her loss. And I know that you're carrying on and you're doing great and seem to be have more energy than ever right now. We've all heard the examples of turning lemons into lemonade. And so the kidnapping actually changed our lives. Susie went through a deep, dark depression for a couple of years, but then she came out of it and became very spiritual. And, it was at that time that we started really aggressively giving back to the community. And she had women's groups, and she would do presentations and speeches on the kidnapping and how you recover from tragedy. Yeah.
And, she was a totally different person, almost to the point where I was thinking, and this kidnapping happened 3 months after we were married. So we'd only been married for 3 months.
Wow. I don't think I got that. I didn't realize that.
And so I'm thinking, because she went through this deep, dark depression, we're newlyweds, and what am I going to do?
Yeah.
She didn't get out of bed for a year.
Wow.
But she did recover and was always, and even more so became just a wonderful, wonderful person, lover, community resource, and she did great things in the community.
Oh, absolutely.
I was very proud of her.
Everybody knows that. That's for sure. Well, I don't want to take too much time. I do want to hit on a couple other subjects, though. And so you end up selling to BB&T, and somewhere in the process of all this, another like this SEC investigation is launched. And I remember when this was going on and just thinking to myself, how can they, I was just, I couldn't believe it. I was beside myself with the whole situation, but you describe it very well in here. And I just think it must have been a great thing for you to, I know you talk about perseverance, but you persevered, you got through, you fought this thing for many years.
10 years.
10 years against the government, which we all know, they have unlimited resources. And it was just, what can you tell us about that?
One of the things we all have is the ability to take advantage of our experiences. And the experience we just talked about 1974 and my cold turkey cutting off, raising money because I thought things were they just couldn't last that way. I recalled that in 2007, where I started to see cracks in our loan portfolio at the bank. And we were also in the home building business at the same time. I started to see cracks in the home building. And the government, Treasury and the Fed were all talking about a soft landing in the economy.
Sounds familiar.
In the economy.
Yeah.
And so I decided in 2007 to look hard in our loan portfolio and identify every loan that I thought would be potentially a problem. I didn't want it to drip, 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 quarter after quarter after quarter. Again, I'm not clairvoyant, but I was seeing things that the government wasn't reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the third quarter of 2007, I wrote down $70 million in loans. Now, we were a $6 billion bank, but I wrote down $70 million in loans. And we got so much flack from Wall Street of those lending cowboys and, how could they have made these terrible loans?
Right.
And I just thought at the time it was the right thing to do. Our stock dropped. And the SEC came in and sued us for securities fraud. That we should have known and did know that those loans were going to be bad several quarters earlier. The market was perking along.
Yeah.
And the banking crisis didn't happen till a year later.
Right.
In the third quarter of 2008.
Yeah.
When Levan went broke and so they pursued this action against us for securities fraud. And I have such high respect for the SEC, corporate finance, but no respect for corporate enforcement. I've always worked well with corporate finance at the SEC, but enforcement filed this lawsuit. And even though we were proven right, and a year later, the market collapsed, so we were way ahead of our time, and the market got worse and worse and worse. And this case went on for 10 years, and the SEC just wanted to settle it from day one. And they said, all you have to do is admit that you did something wrong. And I just refused to do that.
And they wanted to bar you?
They wanted to bar me from being an officer director of a public company. And I was a CEO of 4 New York Stock Exchange companies at that time, at the same time.
Yeah.
And I just refused to do that. And ultimately, obviously, we prevailed.
And then a lot of times I ask people about mentors, but I guess in your case, you had one particular person who was like your consigliere, it was Gene Stearns, who you mentioned in the book. Talk a little about how valuable Gene has been to you.
Well, Gene has been a lawyer and friend really since the 70s. Mm-hmm. And he is He's a litigator. We've used that Stearns Weaver Miller law firm. One of his partners, Allison Miller, has also been in the same category with me, where she does all of our corporate work. But Gene, and Allison is brilliant, but Gene is an extraordinary litigator in that he knows his cases better than the clients do. Gene knows more about my life than I do. And he would go into a courtroom without any notes at all and just be able to handle a 6-week trial without any notes. It's just unbelievable. And he's very steady. But the thing that's just incredible about him, that I have relied on him for, 50 years at this point, is he assesses a case and he would say to me, Alan, you didn't do anything wrong. If you want, I would stay the course and you're going to win this. Now, he never guaranteed I would win it at every level, but he kind of guaranteed I would win it ultimately. And a lot of these had to be appealed because of bad judges or lawyers on the other side that didn't play properly.
Sure. But
ultimately, whenever Gene told me that, I relied on him. So believe it or not, even though those 10 years, and I reference in my book, there were 1,000 articles, 1,000 mentions of Alan Levan and the SEC over that 10-year period. And we just stayed the course. Believe it or not, I just trusted Gene, and I went about building our business, and all our businesses flourished in that 10-year period.
Right.
I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about the SEC case. People find that hard to believe. But when you've got somebody as strong as Gene, who's very calming. Now, there was a time back in the 80s, I came to Gene with an issue. We were raising money to do oil and gas, and the wells were dry, and we lost all the money. And I said to Gene, what should I do? And Gene looked at me and he said, give your investors their money back. I said, Gene, the money's gone. It was in wells that were dry. He says, well, the guys that were doing the drilling we determined were fraudulent. And so I selected them, so it was really my problem. I said, Gene, I don't have the money to give back to the investors. Gene looked at me in the eye and he said, Alan, give your investors their money back. I said, Gene, oil and gas all over the country is a disaster. Everybody's losing their money in oil and gas. And he said, give them their money back. And he didn't want to litigate it. He wouldn't let me litigate it. And he just said, just do the right thing.
Wow.
Even though we didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
We made bad decisions.
Yes.
But we didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And I found the money and I gave the money back.
Wow.
So it wasn't always, wasn't always, I'm going to win your case.
But good advice.
You kind of had to be innocent in order to, for Gene to believe in you.
Right.
He's not a lawyer that plays tricks in the courtroom.
Yeah.
But he can defend you like nobody else.
That's a great story. Well, we could be here. We could do a full-length movie about the life of Alan Levan. But just so many incredible. I mean, I would recommend to people to read this book, no matter how old, because you do take, and there's so many good quotes in every chapter, a few bits of advice. I found it just an incredible book to read. So I would highly recommend it, and I'm sure people will listen and pick this book up. So
thank you, Keith. I actually wrote it for my children and my grandchildren so they would know more about me. I didn't write it to market it or to go on roadshows selling it. So this is actually, even though the book's been out for a couple of years, is the first time I've ever done anything talking about the book.
Yeah.
I've never done any speeches talking about my book. In fact, a lot of my close friends, when I gave them copies of it, it's a very thick book. They said, wow, this would be a really good doorstop. And somebody else said, well, I'll wait for the audio version. So I never really expected people to read it. And it'll be years before my grandchildren actually, I have 12 grandchildren.
Wow.
Before my grandchildren actually wade through all of it. But I appreciate your I appreciate your comments.
And so now you are, you've accomplished so much in your life, and and I was just at NSU this morning with for the ambassador board meeting, which you and your wife Susie established there. You've been very involved with NSU. You've been involved with a lot of organizations here in South Florida, and I guess now you've accomplished so much. How do you see spending the rest of your life?
Well, first of all, giving back gives somebody purpose. And so I've been very, very fortunate in my life. I've had a lot of tragedy in my life. I lost a daughter 5 years ago at 37. I've now lost my wife, both from cancer. But I still consider myself one of the luckiest people alive. Those were great relationships, love, my child, my wife. I wouldn't have changed the kidnapping. I wouldn't have changed a moment of anything. And I just consider myself very fortunate. I am blessed with the ability to move on. And so I don't dwell a lot on the losses. And I've had a lot of personal losses and financial losses, but I just have had the ability to just assess the situation and move on. And I'm optimistic. I'm actually dating, and I feel good. And
great.
I love my wife, but I can't bring her back.
Right. Well, that's a great way to end. And really appreciate you being here today. If people wanted to reach out to you, is there some way for them to get in touch?
Yeah. So I'm still chairman. Jarrett, my son, runs BBX Capital, but I'm still chairman. So if they look up BBX Capital and there's a phone number there, I have an assistant that is still handling everything for me.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Alan. You've been a great guest today. We appreciate you being here with us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Keith.
Absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in to Locality's Making Bank podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to catch the latest episodes, and visit localitybank.com today to learn more about all the benefits of banking local.